So we have a special opportunity today, and that is an opportunity to learn from and speak with Tim McNulty. Tim McNulty is a very important figure for our practice with the EcoSangha, our practice in terms of really trying to retrieve a sense of what it might mean to practice in Cascadia and the full range of that. And so I'll begin, as I always do, by putting on my Roxu. And this is how we also try to deepen our practice and become good listeners to our teachers. So welcome, Tim, and I want to say thank you for all that you've done. You're a huge inspiration to so many of us. Your poetry, your natural history writing, your activism, and how you try to live your life, and in so doing, help others lead their lives. So that's been a really, really wonderful and profound contribution you've made to our beleaguered species.
Well, thank you, Jason. You're way too kind and generous in your words.
So, but the first thing I would like to ask you about is one of the more remarkable things about your writing is how you bring together what are normally very partitioned aspects of the life of the mind: poetry, science and natural history writing, radical politics, environmental activism, and somehow holding everything together, a very subtle, a very elusive, but a very profound spiritual dimension. So my first question then is to invite you to speak how, in your remarkable way, you hold it all together, how it all somehow seems to be different sides of the same Dharma eye.
Well, phrased that way, I think it sounds much more accomplished than it is. The central unifying factor, of course, is the place, the earth. For me, particularly the Olympic Peninsula, but in many ways the greater Northwest, Cascadia, the part of the world where my soul found home, and inspired me, I think, in many ways. Led me to confirm my early path as a poet, as a meaningful way to relate to the earth. Inspired me to delve back into subjects I had earlier pushed aside, basically the hard sciences, geology, forest ecology, botany, the ecology of wildlife. And by wanting to get to know and experience and appreciate the place that I moved to as a young man on a deeper level. Everything, in a sense, kind of flowed out of that like a mountain spring. And it's the continual relationship with the place that I live, I think, that informs trying to be, in one sense, perhaps, a voice for that place and in some different kinds of venues.
One of the themes that comes out in both your natural history writings and your poetry is what the Buddhist tradition calls interdependence, dependent co-origination. So rather than isolating a scientific object and analyzing it kind of frozen outside of its mutual relations,
the Western tradition.
Yeah. There really is a sense in both your poetry and your scientific writing of entering into an interdependent community and seeing how the whole thing works together.
Yeah, well, that idea, which is, of course, an ecological idea that's been around for a long time, I first encountered it in the writings of Aldo Leopold back as a youngster. But becomes such a vibrant image and presence, particularly in the old-growth forest community, where years and centuries of process have established relationships, subtle relationships that I was privileged to be around for some of the first discoveries coming out of Jerry Franklin's work as a research ecologist with the Forest Service and later University of Washington, discovering these relationships between species, processes below the ground, the wonderful complexity of the canopy epiphytes, how that all worked together with wildlife communities. It was almost an unfolding of wonder on a scientific basis that fueled me as a writer and pushed me from poetry into natural history writing and natural history writing in terms of essays, trying to share that enthusiasm, share those stories, in an effort to deepen others' appreciation and involvement with their place. And then, of course, once you look, and on the Olympic Peninsula, I'm afforded the luxury of alpine ecosystems, montane mountain forests, lowland old-growth forest communities, the temperate rainforest, rivers and the salmon cycle, the Olympic coast and intertidal communities that connect with everywhere along the North Pacific. An ability to just explore that idea of connectivity and process, and the wider I looked, the more everything was connected.
Yeah. It's almost as if you could put it like this. I mean, sometimes in your poems you'll mention the Buddha by name, but one never has a sense that you're an ist of any kind, that you're in some kind of doctrinal program. But there still is somehow a kind of Buddhist sensibility, at least in this respect. It's almost as if you've Buddhified ecology and ecologized Buddhism.
I love that idea.
That the two, really it is. And in a world in which our spiritual traditions and our scientific traditions seems to be at each other's necks, here they're fully unified in your work.
Well, my sitting practice, my Zen sitting practice, began at the same time I was just starting to write poetry. It was back in my college days in Boston. I was sitting with the Cambridge Buddhist Association. There was a young monk from Korea there at the time, Il Kwon Shin. And as I was discovering the process of stilling my mind, and through Zazen, I was also exploring the idea of observing closely and getting fully engaged with the natural world, such as it was, such as I was able to access from the city. And the two became just almost part of a single practice when I moved out west. For the first year, I lived on the Olympic Peninsula. I lived out on the coast, and for part of that time was with my girlfriend, who was there for most of the summer, but part of that time was some months alone as well. And at the time, I was working on my meditation practice without a teacher. But at the same time, I was also discovering the coastal landscape, the incredible intertidal communities, and the coastal birds and the spruce forest. And so, the poems and the practice just seemed to go hand in hand that way. And maybe by starting out on both of those paths at the same time and having that initial unity, some of the realizations from one helped express the discoveries of the other.
Yeah. It's almost like you could say one does science better if one does science scientifically, but also mindfully, a more mindful sense of science.
Yeah. Well, I always make the distinction that I don't do original research. Yeah. I'm utterly dependent on those who do, and I have great respect for them. And talk about discipline, combing through data, long-term observation studies. There's a magnificent research project going on in the H.J. Andrus Experimental Forest in Oregon, where they've cut down some trees, and they're looking into the long-term process of the recycling of all of the elements of the trees back into the forest soil. It's a 250 to 300 year scientific study where they're checking in on a decadal level, and so you just have to admire
Yes.
that kind of perspective. It's so against the grain of everything else in our contemporary society. But I find that scientists, many of the scientists that I've spoken with and gone out in the field with, are incredibly generous, altruistic spirits who are very, very happy to share their wisdom with someone who's there to ask stupid questions and maybe push them into thinking about things in new ways as well.
Yeah, I mean, beginner's mind. That's a good
Beginner's mind, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Another strand that comes up that seems somehow part of getting everything to fit together are the original inhabitants, human inhabitants of this area of Cascadia, the indigenous elements. And there is also in your writing and your manner of being present to these things a sense of respect for what Gary Snyder called the old ways.
Oh, yeah.
How would you describe that presence of that in your work?
Well, I have to say a great and deep and abiding respect for the old ways and for the survivors of those old ways who are still thriving and living in vital ways on the Olympic Peninsula. Having the opportunity to spend time in wild country, I was particularly when first learning about the Olympic Peninsula, first spending that winter on the coast. I was in awe of how people took nothing but what was there and evolved this sustainable, long-term culture that had artistic brilliance and incredible deep engagement with place. I had the let's say the accoutrements of 19th century civilization anyway. I had an axe and matches and a kerosene lamp, and so I think just experiencing the landscape in which these cultures developed and thrived gave me, I think, a keen appreciation of what they were able to accomplish. And then meeting the great, generous, storytelling, warm, embracing people of the native cultures on the peninsula continues to be a great reward.
Yeah, I mean, there is a sense in which the rapacity and rapaciousness of settler colonialism, I mean, that's everywhere in the, near ruins at times of Turtle Island.
Absolutely.
And, there is a way in which a Zen, poetic, scientific practice and a very, very deep dialogue with the old ways, it seems like that's almost an essential step for going forward, to learn to be their students.
I think it is. There are things about culture. We were talking about Gary Snyder a little earlier. Gary once wrote that we're still very new at culture out here, the Western colonial inhabitants of Cascadia, of the West Coast, of the West, North America, and so the secrets, the long-term evolutionary wisdom of grounded and landed cultures, we have to look to. And I was thinking today a little bit about the first salmon ceremony, something that was practiced among all of the tribal people on the Olympic Peninsula, and I think throughout most of the Northwest. A very elaborate, sometimes days-long ceremony of welcoming the first salmon swimming up the rivers for spawning. A certain way of preparing the salmon, of sharing it around the community, of returning the bones carefully to the river, upon and only after which the families, in order of priority, would go to their fishing places along the river and begin to partake of the salmon. What that did was allowed a big chunk of the first run of every salmon to swim upstream where they're going to spawn and continue this practice, and continue their existence. Freeman House, a wonderful bioregionalist down in Northern California, wrote about this quite beautifully. And that is, to me, that's the wisdom of a culture, that spiritual practice of welcoming the first salmon came out of some hard-learned evolutionary lessons. And as early populations advanced, and there were more and more people in these rivers, and those are the kinds of spiritual insights I think that we all need to be keen observers of and appreciators of. And it's a spiritual practice, but practically speaking, it is an ecological way of living sustainably in this place. I think that's what the older cultures, some of what the older cultures offer us.
Yeah, I suspect they look at us and our land made poor by taking. We make the land poor, our mode of habitation.
Yes, yes, we do.
As if everything belongs to us, when the hard-won wisdom was the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
We belong to the earth. We live here on its terms.
That's absolutely.
And we're discovering that in a very dramatic fashion right now.
It's coming on very strong, I think. Yeah, there's going to be no denying it here.
But you think what happened even in 3 short centuries. A squirrel could go from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic seaboard 300 or 400 years ago.
That's right.
And now it's unimaginable.
Yeah.
And that was a short time. So I know when people
history collided with Turtle Island, with North America.
It collided.
Yeah.
It was hard. It was like a meteor.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
So I know that people I talk to sometimes, they look at this hard story right in the face. They have the courage to look at it. They have the courage to see really the hard side of the history of the last 300 years in this part of the world, and they become despair-ridden. They fear that before we can even figure out how to talk about an alternative to capitalism, it'll be too late. So when these hard questions come up, without being Pollyannish, how do you help people keep an eye on the prize and keep the activism going and keep the practice rich when the problem is so large and it starts with us?
The problem is large. It starts with us, and it is overwhelming. I mean, we're paying dues now and about to pay dues that were incurred at the beginning of the industrial age. And if we were able to stop all carbon inputs to the atmosphere today, it'd still be another almost a lifetime of degradation of the atmosphere and warming of the climate. I look to the larger natural systems. When we think about the land that we're living on here, buried by ice, 300, or 3,000 feet deep here in the Seattle area, of the natural life coming back out of rubble, following the last glacial advance, a warming period in which wildfires were a way of life. Everything burned on a regular basis. And yet this incredible diversity, this incredible beauty, the richness of the Northwest sprang out of that. These ancient relationships, to me, and the resilience of ecosystems, to me, is what gives me hope. And I don't know what will come out of, our collision here with the world, with the earth. But I have faith that the continuing power of evolution and response to disturbance will lead to something eventually hopefully as complex and as beautiful as what we have here now. How much a part of that we're going to be, I don't know if anybody knows yet.
Yeah. I mean, the earth will probably heal itself. It may not do so with us.
Yeah, it may not do so with us. Many, many species have kind of had their run, more than there are on the earth now. And I don't know if we're going to be part of that parade.
So I'm asked all the time, is Trump a tipping point? is this a spiritual tipping point? Is this just so ugly? I mean, in a way,
Yeah,
it's part and parcel of the problem from the beginning.
it is.
But in a way, it's just so ugly and so bad and so nakedly brutal.
It's the worst possible metaphor.
Yeah.
It's you can imagine the worst. Invent somebody who comes out of, entertainment and greed and avarice and utter disregard for minority populations, for poor people, for the earth, for creatures, for atmosphere, and make him the leader of the free world. You couldn't have imagined a worse scenario. But there it is. I imagine there were some hard times in the history of Buddhism through China, through the dynastic periods of China, and yet what has come out of it is a practice, an approach to life that is centering and enlightening and compassionate, and breaks through across multiple cultures. So.
Yeah, that's the hope. Now, I often think of national parks, national monuments. Ken Burns celebrates these as America's best idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to myself, well, what's that idea then? I guess it would have to be that we stop being so American. That's our best idea. That we fight ourselves, because you spent your life protecting the natural world and its systems from us. Not from humans. Humans were never the problem. It was the kind of human that we are that's the problem.
Well, the kind of human that we are, plus industrial ambition, plus renegade capitalism, plus crony backdoor deals, huge landscapes being given over from public trust into private ownership, all originally going back to defrauding and the genocide of the original inhabitants here. So it's tough going. And when I was thinking back on that on the first salmon ceremony, so that's what a culture does. That's how cultures survive. They internalize these approaches that and ritualize them in a way that they continue. Maybe national parks, national wildlife refuges, wilderness areas, maybe that's what our culture has done in order to save these focal points of ecological process and genetic diversity, and so that no matter what's to come, there will be these small communities of or focal points of evolution and diversity that can then reseed the altered, destroyed, maimed portions of the earth.
Yeah. How do you understand your poetry as part of this activism and this awakening? I mean, people typically think of poetry as maybe beautiful, maybe inspiring, but it's just poetry. It's not science. It's not activism. Mm-hmm. And I know you refuse that. I refuse that. I find the answers to all these things in everything that you do, but including poetry. Mm-hmm. There's a spiritual revolution somehow in your poetry. But how do you see your poetry speaking to these needs? And
well, poetry to me was both a challenge and a revelation. I came to poetry during the Vietnam War. The most vital, accomplished poets of that time were speaking outwardly and writing poems, strong poems against the Vietnam War. And I'm thinking of Denise Levertov and Robert Bly and John Logan, Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder. And it was that poetry that captured our visceral hurt and outrage in a way that the incredible journalism of the day that was being done did not. and it was poetry. I think some of that poetry that first sparked me into political activism, anti-war activism, which preceded my environmental involvement. So I always felt that poetry had that power to inspire, that power to make real, to share and experience some of Denise Levertov's writings about the farming people of Vietnam, about the villagers in Vietnam, about what was happening to them, in a way that was spare and emotional and just full of force, gave me that pretty high expectation of what poetry can accomplish. And though I have kind of strived for that, I have rarely ever felt that I've achieved it.
Well, I think you're quite modest. I also sense in your poetry another feature that I find quite revolutionary. And the analogy I would use would be, say, a Zen talk. In a Zen talk, of course, you want to say important things and be perceptive about things that matter. But you're also showing your mind. You're also showing with words and with your manner of doing poetry, because there's poetry and there's poetry. But your style, I also sense deep exhibition of what it is to be here, what it is to be attuned here, what it is to develop the mind of this place and to show that mind, not just with what you say, but how you say it, what you select, how you become aware of things.
Well, I've had some good teachers along the way, both living presences. I mentioned Denise Levertov, Gary Snyder, Robert Sund, as well as the masters of the past. And I mentioned earlier, I think in our talk here, the parallel paths of beginning writing poetry and beginning a meditation practice, and the clarity and directness coming out of sitting, I think, was a wonderful way to turn that on to the natural world, the world surrounding me, when I was living in this place. And I learned from the haiku masters, Basho, Busan, Issa, the power of image. And here around me was a plethora of natural imagery. And so I guess my task was to try to apply that tradition to here in this place and see how I could, kind of grasp the world around me, present it in language in a way that might carry some of that enthusiasm, some of that appreciation to the reader.
Yeah, and do a beautiful job. Tell us about your relationship with Robert Sund. He's another one of the really legendary,
Yes,
like yourself, who really dedicated his life to giving a voice to what it is to be here.
Yeah, he was, and Robert was a native of the Northwest, unlike me, an interloper who came here as a young man. He grew up in a Swedish-speaking neighborhood, South Olympic Peninsula, Chehalis Valley, rural farm people. They farmed with horses, and Robert worked in the woods when railroad logging was still going on, and fished up north in Alaska when they were still pulling their nets by hand, and so comes out of the earth of the Northwest in a way that I recognized when I met Robert in the early 70s was something that was vanishing. I mean, I strove for that in myself by working in the woods, tree planting, and trail work, and trying to have that kind of a connection with the earth. Robert came out of a culture of a few generations that had been doing that. And then, of course, went to the University of Washington, met the great poet and teacher Theodore Retke, and a legendary teacher, and set Robert on a course of poetry. And I think he was never comfortable with the academic track. And in those years when he was in college, 50s, That was, if you wanted to be a poet, that's what you did. You became a professor, and that gave you the opportunity to write. And he wanted to stay true to his roots. And so I think by going and working the wheat harvests in eastern Washington and writing his first book, Bunchgrass, he kind of established himself as a voice of not only this beautiful spare landscape of eastern Washington, but of a voice coming from people who have lived closely to the land for a few generations and had that. Of course, coming back to the west side, writing his poems during his pretty long stays out at Shai Beach, and later up his little cabin on the Skagit Flats of the estuary of the Skagit River. He really kind of embodied the old Sung Dynasty, approach of the educated scholar leaving all the bullshit behind and, living close to the natural world, to the truth of nature, and living a life of simplicity and directness and, and artistic integrity. And Robert embodied that. I mean, there was a lot of bumps along the way, as all of his friends knew.
Yeah.
But he gave it his best shot of trying to live that life. And I was fortunate to meet Robert when I was a pretty young guy. He was very supportive of my poetry, and I learned a lot from him, particularly about delivering of poetry, how to read and present poetry. And he had a tradition of there was a community of Tibetan Buddhists in Seattle at that time. I don't know very much about it, but he spent time with those guys. They gave him this Tibetan Buddhist name, and he always had a great reverence for the way.
Yeah. And of course, he lived right next to the Swinomish Reservation, too. Did that have an effect?
Yeah, he did. And it was amazing. I think, Robert did some teaching in the schools up there, LeConner. And it seemed wherever I went with him in town, the native people loved him. And he seemed to fit very comfortably in with that society as well, and was always introducing me to people, Swinomish people, and and he would tell them that this is my friend Tim, who's a poet over on the Olympic Peninsula, and then of course, our friends so and the tribal interconnections among the many 6-7 tribal nations on the peninsula. So, yeah, I think that was part of it. You don't see that overtly in his poetry too much, at least I don't. But he sure had a wonderful friendship with many, many people.
Yes, and he knew he lived in Ish River country.
Yeah, he did. And his, that little name that he coined was an homage to the Salish names of the people of the river, Swinomish, Snohomish, Skykomish, Skokomish, people of the river. And that's who we were, and who we are really still in the Northwest. And if there's a future here, it's who we've got to become again.
Yeah, we have to learn to figure out who we are.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a perfect segue then to our final part, which, as someone who's dedicated his life to really, in your own way, giving word and giving language to what it is to be here. If I could invite you to read 2 poems for us of your choosing, 2 poems that you think would speak to our occasion and to my good benefit of having the pleasure to learn from you and to speak with you.
Okay, I think I can come up with something. Take a look here. This is a poem that's called A Mountain Blessing. And it comes from an encounter with bears. I love bears. The bears roam through my poetry from time to time. I've been accused of bear worship. Yeah, perhaps.
I'm nicknamed Bear. That's my nickname.
Oh, is that right? Well, it fits you well. So this is a poem that takes place up in the Olympic Mountains. It's a late afternoon that reflects back on a previous evening, and then the poem comes back around to the afternoon. A mountain blessing. Across the high basin, green sloping meadows and bands of rock drop steeply to a cobalt lake. Slow metallic trickles ring from withering snowbanks. Scraps of cloud dissipate, and the mountain world is numinous with light. Last night, 4 bare, small shadows, darker than the shadowed cliffs, emerged and prowled the ledges and skirts of meadow, hungry for summer sweet berries. We watched as they moved easily across cliff face and hanging meadow. The she-bear and her cub descended a wall of broken rock on invisible steps. Another stemmed a smooth, water-worn gully to a hidden pocket meadow and disappeared. We stayed until cold and coming darkness sent us back over rocks and hummocks to camp. Now, as afternoon shadows cross the slope and breezes ruffle the lake, I listen for the ceramic clack of stone on stone and watch for those deepest of shadows to re-emerge from shrubby cloisters of trees. I wait, attentive and hopeful as a supplicant, for that blessing of the wild to wash over me like a fine north wind and deepen my winter dreams.
That's really extraordinary.
I found in some research that if you go back to the Greeks, bears were associated with dreaming because they're such great sleepers, right?
Yes.
And so that I wanted to kind of fold a little of that in. And I'm going to go back to my first book for my last poem, because I think it touches on some of the things we've been talking about. It tries to do so with images. And it's called Samara. And Samara, of course, are the winged seeds that grow on maples and several other trees. And they seemed to me, thinking about them as a wonderful little metaphor for what we try to do in poetry, sending our poems out. Samara. Let these lines become then a seed, yet enough of a bird to form as fruit a wing. Inside a hint of motion, a breath, but born against the flux and current of what is a sail. Maybe it finds ground and regathers there somehow the shape of itself, small, out of nothingness, like maple.
It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for all that you've done, for what you've shared with us today. Like I said, you're really a big inspiration to us all as we try to take the mountains into the Zendo and the Zendo into the mountains. Poetry in one hand, the science has been done diligently for us in the other. But you've really shown us a way, so
Yes,
thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful experience talking with you today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.